Mexico. 1985. Sunlight spills over the rooftops of Guadalajara. Vendors shout in crowded streets. Church bells echo off stucco walls. It feels almost peaceful. But somewhere behind a white steel gate, a man is screaming. His name is Enrique Camarena. To his friends, he's just Kiki. A father. A husband. A U.S. Marine turned DEA agent. He believed in justice. In truth. In the idea that one man can make a difference. But today, he's bound, beaten, and begging to die. For 30 hours, he's tortured, kept alive with drugs, just so the pain doesn't stop. His ribs broken. His jaw shattered. But his spirit still fighting. Outside, the U.S. government scrambles. The Mexican government denies. And the cartel laughs in the face of them both. Because in 1985, the Guadalajara Cartel didn't just own the drug trade. They owned the system. And when the body finally turns up, dumped in a shallow grave, wrapped in plastic like trash, the world watches, and does nothing. His death was supposed to be the end. But what came next? That was worse. Because what if I told you that some of the very people sworn to protect him may have helped orchestrate it? That his killers live free, some even protected. And that justice, the thing Kiki died for, was sold off, piece by piece, to protect secrets darker than cocaine. This story isn't just about a murder. It's about what happens when one man gets too close to the truth. And the world decides it's easier to let him die. They say he was a hero. But heroes die. And in Kiki's case, they die screaming while governments look away. Today, we tell the story no one was supposed to finish. Of betrayal. Of politics. Of torture and silence. And the cover-up that followed. This isn't a theory. This isn't a Netflix drama. This is real. This happened. And the full truth has never been told. So ask yourself, what would you do if your government traded your life for silence? Because this story doesn't end with a gunshot. It ends with a whisper. And we're about to follow it. All the way back to the beginning. This is the DEA agent who was tortured to death, and the cover-up that followed. Before we dive into the full story, I've got a small favor to ask. If you're enjoying this kind of deep, real true crime content, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, drop a comment, and let me know what city you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into the story. A husband. A father. A U.S. agent. And in 1985, he vanished. He wasn't just any agent. He was the one who got too close. The one who found what no one was supposed to find. Guadalajara, Mexico. A cartel that thought it was untouchable. A government too scared, or too corrupt, to stop it. And one man who refused to look away. This is the story of how a billion-dollar empire was protected by silence. And how justice was buried alongside the body. He thought his badge made him immune. He thought America would come for him. He thought wrong. For 30 hours, he was kept alive. Tortured. Questioned. Injected with drugs, just to make sure he didn't pass out before they were done. And when they had what they needed, they left him in a shallow grave. In a field not far from the city. The cartel wanted silence. Washington wanted distance. And Kiki Camarena? He became a symbol, too powerful to ignore, too dangerous to investigate. You may think you know this story. That it's about drugs. Cartels. Corruption. But it's not. It's about the cost of knowing too much. The kind of truth you can't unlearn. The kind of death no government wants to explain. Because what happened in that house didn't just kill a man. It exposed a network that reached far beyond Mexico. past the DEA, past the CIA, and maybe all the way back home. The men who killed him. Protected. Released. Rewarded. And the man who gave everything was given nothing. His wife waited. His children asked questions. And the government sealed the files. This is not just a story of a murder. It's the story of a betrayal. A cover-up that spanned continents. And a man who never stood a chance, because he stood for too much. This is True Crime Cartel. And you're about to hear the story they tried to bury. The story of Enrique Kiki Camarena. The DEA agent who was tortured to death. And the cover-up that followed. But to understand his death, we have to go back. Back to the man. Back to the mission. Back to the moment the countdown began. They called him Kiki. Not Agent Camarena. Not the gringo. Just Kiki. To his family, he was a husband, a father, a quiet protector. To the streets he walked, he was something else. A shadow behind sunglasses. A man with questions. And soon, the man everyone feared had answers. He was born in Mexicali, just across the border from California. The son of migrant workers. A child who straddled two nations, never quite belonging to either. As a kid, he'd pick crops alongside his mother and brothers, while others played Little League. He knew poverty. He knew work. And from an early age, he knew what justice wasn't. After high school, he joined the Marines. Served honorably. Came back. Became a cop in Calexico. But the street-level arrests didn't feel like real change. What he wanted was the top. Not the corner dealer. The supplier. The web behind the spider. So in 1974, he joined the DEA. The agency was young then. Only a year older than his marriage. Built during Nixon's war on drugs, but under Reagan, the war became a crusade. And Kiki was a true believer. In 1981, he was promoted. In 1982, reassigned to Guadalajara, Mexico. Not an easy post. Not a desk job. This was the deep end of the drug war. And the water was rising. The Guadalajara of the 1980s wasn't just a city. It was a kingdom. And at the center of that kingdom stood a man. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. A former federal police officer turned billionaire kingpin. Nicknamed El Padrino, the Godfather. And he didn't run from the law. He was the law. Alongside him, two lieutenants. Rafael Caro Quintero, a hothead with money to burn. And Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, cold, calculating, invisible. Together, they built the Guadalajara Cartel. And with the help of the CIA, the DFS, and Mexican federal police, they turned marijuana into gold. At the time, the DEA knew something was happening. But they didn't know what. Or how big. Or who was behind it. Kiki was assigned to find out. But he didn't work like the others. He didn't take bribes. He didn't drink with the Federals. And he didn't blink. He began slow. Surveillance. Following supply trucks, tracing real estate deals. And then, he started hearing whispers. About a ranch. Massive. Remote. Untouched by police. Rancho Buffalo. Officially, it was a cattle ranch. Unofficially, it was the largest marijuana plantation on Earth. Over 2,000 acres. 7,000 workers. Millions in daily profits. And guarded by corrupt military units paid in gold, guns, and fear. Kiki got too close. He took photos. Interviewed locals. Filed reports that vanished from official channels. He told the DEA, this ranch is real. And it's protected. They didn't listen. But Kiki didn't stop. The more he dug, the more things didn't make sense. Why was the Mexican government turning a blind eye? Why were certain DEA documents being blocked? Why did the cartel always seem one step ahead? And then came the call that changed everything. A tip, quiet, panicked, anonymous. They're watching you. Stop now. Or your family won't see you again. Kiki didn't tell his wife. Didn't file a formal complaint. He just locked his windows at night. And kept going. By late 1984, Rancho Buffalo was raided. Burned to ash. Millions of dollars lost. Cartel leadership humiliated. No arrests. No press conferences. No justice. But everyone knew who caused it. One name. Kiki. And now, he had a target on his back. The cartel wasn't just angry. They were scared. Kiki wasn't supposed to get that far. Wasn't supposed to connect the dots. Wasn't supposed to be that good. He had exposed the cracks in the empire. And cracks, in a place like Guadalajara, don't go unpunished. In January 1985, Kiki wrote one final report. It named names. It linked politicians. It detailed meetings with U.S. intelligence assets. And it warned. If I disappear, this is why. 2 weeks later. He disappeared. This was never just about marijuana. It wasn't even just about cocaine. It was about power. And the man who got too close was now too far gone. To understand the death of Kiki Camarena, you have to understand the world that needed him gone. And the machine built to keep him silent. You don't become the most powerful cartel in the world by hiding. You do it by owning the system. And in Mexico during the 1980s, the Guadalajara Cartel didn't run from the government. They ran it. It didn't start as a superpower. Like all empires, it started in shadows. In the late 1970s, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was still just a man with ambition. A former cop. A fixer. A man who knew everyone and owed no one. He had something no one else had. The Rolodex of a lifetime. Governors. Mayors. Police chiefs. Even federal agents. He'd spent years greasing the system. Making deals. Calling in favors. And when it was time to build an empire, he cashed in. His first call? Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, nicknamed Don Neto. A silent architect of crime. Old school. Disciplined. Ruthless. The kind of man who never spoke unless it was important. And when he did speak, people listened, or they died. His second call? A wild card. Rafael Caro Quintero. Young. Brash. Addicted to speed, cars, women, and cocaine. He didn't walk into rooms. He burst into them. But he had land. He had soldiers. And he knew how to grow weed like no one else. Together, they formed the holy trinity of narco-terror. Gallardo, the CEO. Don Neto, the strategist. Caro, the explosive visionary. They didn't share power. They carved it up. And Mexico became their chessboard. Their first innovation? The plazas. Gallardo divided Mexico into narco zones. Each controlled by lieutenants loyal to him. Each paying tribute to the center. Each protected, not by distance, but by government consent. Police commanders didn't investigate cartel activity. They facilitated it. Military didn't raid warehouses. They guarded them. Judges didn't sentence traffickers. They called to warn them first. And the politicians? They smiled for the cameras. And cashed their checks in secret. The money flowing through Mexico was unimaginable. In 1 year alone, the cartel pulled in over $5 billion. Untaxed. Untouched. Unstoppable. In the U.S.? They knew. And they hated it. But they couldn't touch it. Because Mexico wasn't theirs to touch. DEA agents were stationed across the country. They filed reports. They documented flights. They tracked wire transfers, watched stash houses. And every time they got close, someone tipped off the cartel. Frustration turned into fury. They knew where the drugs were grown. They knew who loaded the planes. But they weren't allowed to act. Because every time they moved, someone higher up pulled the brakes. Not just in Mexico, but in Washington. Why? Because the CIA had its own interests. Central America was on fire. The Contras. The Sandinistas. And America's war on communism? It ran through the same airstrips as the cartel's cocaine. So Kiki Camarena wasn't just hunting traffickers. He was stepping into a geopolitical nightmare. And Gallardo knew it. So did Caro. And Fonseca? He didn't say much. But he ordered the cleanup teams. The cartel's true power wasn't violence. It was integration. They were in the government's bloodstream. Doctors. Lawyers. Generals. Bankers. Everyone had a piece of the pie. You couldn't cut out the rot. Because the rot was the system. But the arrogance of kings is believing the rules will never change. Gallardo wanted to go global. He was already moving cocaine for the Colombians, Medellin, Cali, Escobar himself. He envisioned a narco-NAFTA, a network that would rival any nation. He bought homes in California. Laundered money through casinos, real estate, even nightclubs. He wasn't hiding in the jungle. He was living in luxury, protected by the same politicians that shook his hand during fundraisers. But Caro Quintero wasn't satisfied. After Rancho Buffalo was burned, he felt embarrassed. Humiliated. And when Kiki's name came up again, he didn't wait for approval. He didn't want justice. He wanted revenge. The decision to kidnap Kiki Camarena wasn't made in a boardroom. It was made in a moment of rage. A split-second impulse. That would unravel everything. The empire they built was about to crack. Because they hadn't just touched a DEA agent. They touched America's pride. And in 1985, that meant war. But the truth is, the war had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. Because the betrayal didn't start with Kiki's murder. It started with every deal that bought silence. Every phone call that warned the cartel. Every handshake that buried the truth. The Guadalajara Cartel didn't just own Mexico. They owned the illusion that justice could work. And when Kiki disappeared, that illusion shattered. The cartel believed they had covered every angle. That every witness could be bought. That every official had a price. But what they didn't count on was that Kiki left behind breadcrumbs. Audio tapes. Surveillance logs. Names that hadn't yet been erased. And as those names surfaced, the storm began to form. Not just in Mexico, but in Langley. In Washington. In the halls of power. Because one man's murder was about to expose the cover-up of a generation. By late 1984, Kiki Camarena was getting close. Too close. He didn't know it yet. But the walls weren't just closing in around the cartel. They were folding in on him. He had uncovered the crown jewel of the Guadalajara Cartel. A plantation so massive, it could be seen from the sky. A drug empire hidden in plain sight. 2,500 acres. Thousands of workers. And the operation was called Rancho Buffalo. Kiki had been watching from a distance. Gathering whispers. Collecting clues. He followed paper trails no one else had noticed. Lease agreements. Crop shipments. He spotted fake companies funneling millions to one place. And all of them led to the same desert. He didn't have a badge big enough to raid it. But he had proof. His reports to the DEA were growing longer, sharper, and more dangerous. Inside those files were names. Powerful ones. Landowners. Mayors. Customs officers. Men whose signatures authorized poison to cross borders. Men who swore they were fighting the war on drugs, but were actually fueling it. And Kiki? He was quietly mapping them out. Brick by brick. He was rebuilding the truth. But you don't hunt a cartel without them hunting back. Kiki noticed the signs. His car was being followed. Radios clicked on when he walked past. One morning, his usual street food vendor wasn't there. And the guy who replaced him wasn't smiling. His colleagues told him to back off. To slow down. But Kiki couldn't. Not when the numbers didn't lie. Rancho Buffalo was producing 8,000 tons of marijuana, with a street value of nearly $8 billion. It wasn't just a farm. It was the engine behind the Guadalajara Cartel. Take it down, and the whole house might fall. That was the theory. And so, in November 1984, he gave the green light. And Mexican soldiers, real ones this time, moved in. They didn't knock. They burned it all to ash. The raid was hailed a victory. DEA agents celebrated in Washington. Headlines ran across the globe. But back in Guadalajara, something snapped. Gallardo wasn't angry. Don Neto wasn't surprised. But Caro Quintero? He exploded. He had built that ranch. Planted the seeds himself. Spent years crafting the perfect smuggling pipeline. He saw it not as a business loss, but as a personal betrayal. And for that, someone had to pay. Kiki didn't back down. Not after the raid. Not after the whispers. He kept investigating. Kept meeting informants. Kept collecting evidence. But the watchers were closing in. One informant, codenamed Felipe, told Kiki what he already suspected. They know who you are. They know what you've done. And they're planning something. Kiki brushed it off. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was duty. Or maybe he thought he still had time. But time was the one thing he didn't have. In early 1985, DEA surveillance picked up chatter. The gringo must go. It's him or us. No more warnings. The cartel had made a decision. And this time, they weren't just planning a hit. They wanted to make a statement. Meanwhile, Kiki was wrapping up what would be his final report. A list of over 50 high-ranking Mexican officials linked to the cartel. Names that would shake both countries. Names that, if released, could collapse entire agencies. But that report? It never made it home. February 7, 1985. Guadalajara. Kiki Camarena left his office at lunchtime. He walked toward his car. And 3 men were waiting. One had a badge. One had a gun. And one had orders. They threw him into the vehicle. Broad daylight. No masks. No subtlety. Because they weren't hiding. Not from the DEA. Not from the Mexican police. Not from anyone. They didn't need to. Within hours, Kiki was in a house. The walls were soundproofed. The floor was tiled. And the tape recorder was already rolling. The interrogation was about to begin. But this wasn't about information. This was about punishment. The man who uncovered a billion-dollar empire was now trapped inside its heart. And across the border, the U.S. Embassy was already on high alert. But no one knew the truth yet. Not the DEA. Not the press. Not even Kiki's family. Only one thing was certain. The man who stood between two nations had just vanished into the shadows. And what happened next would shock the world. February 7, 1985. Guadalajara. A warm Thursday afternoon. People are out. Vendors are shouting. Children laugh in the distance. It's a normal day. Until it isn't. 2 p.m. DEA Special Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena walks toward his car, a red Volkswagen Beetle parked just outside the consulate. He doesn't notice the men watching. Not at first. They're dressed like Mexican federal judicial police. But they're not here to protect anyone. They're here to make him disappear. The ambush is quick. Brutal. Precise. One grabs Kiki by the arm. Another shoves a pistol into his ribs. A third opens the door of a waiting car. And before the security guards inside the consulate can even react, Kiki is gone. Nobody moves. People see it. They know something is wrong. But this is Mexico in 1985. The cartel wears uniforms. The law serves the highest bidder. And everyone on that street knows one truth. Interfere, and you die too. The tan car peels off. Kiki is trapped in the back, flanked by two men with cold eyes and loaded weapons. And just like that, the U.S. loses one of its own. Kiki doesn't scream. He doesn't beg. He knows what's happening. He knew this day might come. But even he didn't know how far they would go. He's driven through Guadalajara for nearly an hour. No sirens. No backup. Just silence and sweat. Eventually, they stop in front of a nondescript house in a quiet, upper-class neighborhood. The kind of place where nothing bad ever seems to happen. Until the doors close. Inside, it's already prepared. Plastic sheets on the floor. Towels. Ropes. A tape recorder. In a room that would soon become infamous. 881 Lope de Vega. Meanwhile, back at the U.S. consulate, panic spreads like wildfire. Kiki didn't just vanish. He was taken. By people who were supposed to be allies. In broad daylight. With no resistance. Washington is alerted within the hour. The DEA is furious. The CIA, silent. The Mexican government, pretending they're shocked. But behind the scenes, everyone already knows. This wasn't random. This was authorized. Hours pass. No ransom call. No demands. Just silence. And then, it begins. Inside that house, Kiki Camarena is tied to a chair. His eyes are covered. But he hears them. The voices. The laughter. The footsteps. Caro Quintero is there. So is Fonseca Carrillo. And a physician. Because what comes next isn't meant to kill him quickly. It's meant to send a message. To the DEA. To the U.S. government. To anyone who dares come after them again. Kiki is tortured for over 30 hours. He's beaten. Electrocuted. Injected with stimulants to keep him awake. His ribs are broken. His skull is fractured. He's questioned again and again. About what he knew. Who he told. What he gave the DEA. The entire session. Recorded. Later, that tape would become infamous. Passed around within the DEA like a holy relic of horror. You can hear Kiki. Begging. Weeping. Trying to hold on. Trying not to break. But the screams aren't what haunt the agents who heard it. It's the laughter in the background. Back in D.C., the Reagan administration is under pressure. How did this happen? How could a DEA agent vanish, be tortured, on foreign soil, and nothing be done? But the truth is, they already know. The CIA had ties. The Mexican DFS had dirty hands. And for years, those alliances had kept the drug war quietly profitable. But now? The mask had slipped. The illusion was gone. America's war on drugs had a martyr. And behind closed doors, something darker had cracked open. A cover-up. Kiki Camarena had uncovered too much. His reports pointed fingers at generals. At agencies. At politicians. And that's why no one came for him. Not in time. Because rescuing him meant exposing them. February 9, 1985. Kiki Camarena is dead. His body dumped in a shallow ditch outside a ranch in Michoacan. Wrapped in plastic. Beaten beyond recognition. Left like garbage. But what they didn't count on was what his death would ignite. Because in the weeks that followed, Kiki's name became a battle cry. Operation Leyenda was launched. The largest DEA homicide investigation in history. Agents were sent. Doors were kicked. Heads began to roll. But still, the real story, the one behind the smiles and photo ops, was being buried. Why? Because if the full truth came out, if the cover-up was exposed, it wouldn't just take down traffickers. It would take down governments. It would tear apart alliances. And show the world that justice had a price tag all along. And Kiki? He paid it in full. He wasn't just a casualty. He was a threat. To the cartel. To the crooked cops. And maybe, to his own government. That's why he vanished. That's why the world stayed silent. And now, 40 years later, the question remains. Was it a cartel hit? Or an international betrayal? The tapes resurface. The US government points fingers. But no one wants to take the blame. And the man most responsible? He disappears like smoke. The sun was still shining when they took him. By the time it set, he was already bleeding. They didn't throw punches. Not right away. They tied him to a wooden chair, in the middle of a bedroom, inside a pink stucco house in Guadalajara's upscale neighborhood. 881, Lope de Vega Street. A house with curtains drawn. A house with secrets. Inside that house, time stopped. For 30 hours, Kiki Camarena would be beaten, drugged, interrogated, and mutilated. Not by amateurs. Not by street thugs. But by trained doctors. Corrupt federal police. And cartel enforcers who had been told one thing. Make him talk. But make him hurt. They wanted to know everything. Names. Faces. How much the DEA knew about their superlabs. Who burned Rancho Buffalo? Who gave him intel? But Kiki? He stayed quiet. At first. Then came the punches. To the gut. To the ribs. To the face. He lost a tooth. But he didn't scream. So they switched tactics. They brought in a doctor, one on Caro Quintero's payroll. He carried a bag of tools. Not scalpels. Not syringes. But amphetamines and stimulants. To keep Kiki awake. To keep him conscious. Because this wasn't about information anymore. This was about punishment. For 30 hours, they broke his body. They fractured his skull. They crushed his cheekbones. They shattered his ribs with a metal pipe. And when he passed out, they injected him again. Forced him awake. Why? Because pain wasn't just a tool. It was the message. This is what happens when you cross us. Outside that house, life continued. Cars passed. Kids played soccer. Vendors sold tortillas. No one knew that just a few feet away, a man was enduring the most infamous torture session in drug war history. Or maybe they knew. And looked the other way. Because in Guadalajara, the cartel wasn't hiding. It owned the street. Inside the room, the air grew thick. The floor was slick with blood. And the tape recorder rolled on. Yes, they recorded it. Every word. Every cry. Every desperate breath. Why would they record it? Because they were arrogant. Because they were proud. Because they thought no one could ever touch them. But that tape would later become the smoking gun. Kiki pleaded for his family. For his wife. For his 2 sons. Not to save him. Just to make sure they were safe. They ignored him. "You should have stayed in America," one interrogator sneered. "This isn't your country. This isn't your war." By hour 14. Kiki couldn't see anymore. One of his eye sockets had collapsed. By hour 20. He could barely breathe. His lungs had begun to fill with fluid from internal bleeding. But he was still alive. Why? Because they kept him that way. On purpose. He never gave them what they wanted. He never confessed. He never begged. He never broke. And in the end, that's what broke them. Because after 30 hours, after his body had given out, they still didn't have the answers. Only one thing remained. To make him disappear. They wrapped him in plastic. Like the product they moved. And they dumped him in a shallow grave, in a mango orchard. Next to another DEA agent's pilot, Alfredo Zavala. 2 bodies. 1 message. Don't come back. And yet, Kiki did come back. In the form of outrage. Of investigations. Of Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation in DEA history. His death became a rallying cry. A line that even the most corrupt government couldn't ignore. But it wasn't just justice they found. It was something else. The tape. The one that had recorded it all. When agents raided a cartel compound, they found it. Dusty. Forgotten. Almost erased. But when they played it, they heard it. The screams. The beatings. The begging. The truth could no longer be denied. Not by the press. Not by the White House. Not by Mexico. The cartel hadn't just killed a man. They had declared war on the United States. And Kiki? He never got to see what came next. He never saw the arrests. The trials. The betrayals. The cover-ups. All he left behind was a widow. 2 sons. And a recording that shattered the silence. He didn't die quickly. He didn't die cleanly. He died as a message. And for a while. That message worked. But what if I told you? The men who ordered his torture walked free. That his death was only the beginning? Because what followed was a cover-up so deep. It reached the halls of power. March 5, 1985. A dirt road in Michoacan. Just outside the small town of La Angostura. A tractor had stalled in a dusty field. Its wheels had sunk into something soft beneath the soil. Something that didn't belong. What they uncovered wasn't just a corpse. It was a statement. An echo of agony. A warning to the world. Enrique Kiki Camarena's body was found in a shallow grave. Wrapped in plastic. Hands bound. Skull crushed. Jaw shattered. Beside him, his pilot, Alfredo Zavala. Murdered. Dumped. Discarded like trash. Kiki had vanished a month before. And now, he was back. But not in one piece. It was the most brutal cartel killing of a U.S. federal agent in history. And in that moment, something snapped. Not just in the DEA. Not just in the U.S. government. But in the entire framework of the war on drugs. This wasn't just a murder. It was a direct attack on the badge. On the stars and stripes. On the illusion that American agents were untouchable. The official response came within hours. A codename whispered into corridors of power. Operation Leyenda. Spanish for legend. And that's what this investigation would become. Led by seasoned DEA agents with fire in their bellies and names on their kill lists. Leyenda became the largest homicide investigation in DEA history. They didn't just want justice. They wanted revenge. And they wouldn't ask twice. They flooded Mexico with intel units. Called in CIA assets. intercepted communications, interrogated informants, threatened allies, and kicked down doors. First target? Rafael Caro Quintero. The man who ordered the abduction. The man who personally directed the torture. For weeks, he'd been hiding like a phantom. But even phantoms leave footprints. He fled through back channels. Crossed into Costa Rica using a fake identity. Thought he'd escaped. But justice was closing in. On April 4, 1985, barely a month after Kiki's body was found, Caro Quintero was captured. Not in a dramatic shootout. Not on the run. But drunk. And confused. He hadn't expected them to come that fast. He hadn't expected America to break protocol. He thought he was still protected. He wasn't. But Caro wasn't the only one on the list. There was Don Neto, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. Captured shortly after. Hiding in plain sight. In a Guadalajara mansion guarded by dozens of federal police. Yes, police. The very people tasked with catching him. Had been shielding him all along. And then, there was Gallardo. Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo. The boss. The brain. The architect of the entire narco-state. He was untouchable. Surrounded by layers of influence, governors, businessmen, generals. The U.S. demanded his arrest. Mexico stalled. They claimed they needed more evidence. They claimed internal review. But the truth was uglier. Gallardo was the system. And arresting him would mean admitting that the entire system was compromised. So, for years, he walked free. While Kiki's widow buried her husband. Behind the scenes, pressure boiled. Sanctions were threatened. Diplomatic ties frayed. American agents were pulled from Mexican soil. The U.S.-Mexico relationship reached its lowest point in decades. And the message was crystal clear. If you can't bring justice, we will. And yet, even with Operation Leyenda in full force, something never felt right. Some reports vanished. Some names were redacted. And some arrests never happened. Why? Because too many hands had touched the blood. Too many powerful people stood to fall. And too many secrets would be exposed if the truth was ever brought to light. So instead of a purge, there were sacrifices. Caro went to prison. Don Neto too. But Gallardo? He wouldn't face justice until 1989. 4 years later. And even then, he wasn't extradited. He stayed in Mexico. Protected. By then, the dust had settled. The headlines faded. And the U.S. had moved on. Kiki Camarena was buried. Operation Leyenda was scaled down. And the war? It just changed uniforms. But the wound never closed. Not for the DEA. Not for Kiki's family. Not for the agents who watched justice slip through the cracks of diplomacy. Because when the world's most powerful nation can't protect one of its own, what hope does anyone else have? But the story doesn't end there. Because behind the arrests, behind the headlines, behind the flag-draped coffins, there's another truth. One that was never printed. Never officially acknowledged. Never fully answered. What if someone helped cover it up? What if the cartel wasn't acting alone? What if Kiki was betrayed, from both sides of the border? Fine. Justice. We like to believe it's simple. That it moves in straight lines. That if someone commits evil, they're punished. That heroes are honored. And that killers are caught. But when it came to the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, none of that was true. Not even close. For years, the official story was this. The Guadalajara Cartel, enraged by Kiki's surveillance of their empire, kidnapped him. They interrogated him, tortured him, then killed him. The DEA, in response, launched Operation Leyenda, the largest homicide investigation in the agency's history. Several cartel figures were arrested. Some were extradited. A few were convicted. Justice was served. That's the version the public was told. But behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a trickle of documents began surfacing. Court filings, redacted memos, testimonies that had been sealed for decades. And in the margins of those forgotten pages was a question no one wanted to ask. Did Kiki die because he knew too much? Multiple sources began to say the quiet part out loud. Kiki's murder wasn't just a cartel retaliation. It was a strategic silencing. And not just by drug traffickers, but by the very forces sworn to stop them. The Central Intelligence Agency. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, until you follow the trail. In 1990, former DEA agent Héctor Barrales, who led the Camarena investigation, began uncovering inconsistencies. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. Mexican officials stonewalled key leads. And then, a former cartel pilot confessed. He claimed that when Kiki was abducted, CIA agents were in the room. The pilot's name was Tosh Plum Lee. An American. A spook. A self-declared CIA contractor. And he swore under oath that guns and drugs were being moved with U.S. approval. Through the very same networks Kiki was trying to shut down. In other words, Kiki had stumbled into a secret war. And he wasn't supposed to survive it. Then came Phil Jordan, former director of the DEA's El Paso Intelligence Center. He said flatly, the CIA ordered the murder of Kiki Camarena. Of course, the agency denied it. They always deny it. But every new file raised more questions. Why was the CIA station chief in Mexico City never interviewed? Why were phone logs erased? Why were key witnesses deported before they could testify? Then, in 2013, nearly 30 years after the murder, Barrales gave an interview that shook everything loose. He claimed the DEA had gathered direct evidence that CIA operatives were present during Kiki's torture. Not just watching. Participating. He wasn't just tortured, Barrales said. He was interrogated. For information. Not revenge. Why? Because Kiki had uncovered CIA-backed smuggling routes. Planes that flew guns into Nicaragua. And returned to Mexico full of cocaine. He knew too much. And someone wanted him erased. To this day, no CIA officer has been prosecuted. No formal investigation has been opened. Every Freedom of Information Act request? Stonewalled. Because the truth doesn't live in headlines. It lives in redacted footnotes and sealed testimonies. Whistleblowers came forward. Some fled the country. Some were discredited. Others just vanished. And every time someone got close to the truth, a door slammed shut. So now, ask yourself. If the system allowed this, what else has it allowed? Was justice served? Or was it staged? Did the U.S. government really do everything to catch Kiki's killers? Or did they stop just short of the truth? Because going further would have meant exposing themselves. This wasn't about one man. It was about the machine. The war on drugs. The war on communism. The war on truth. All woven together in a tapestry of silence. We tell ourselves that America always tries to do what's right. That when one of our own dies, justice will follow. That our agencies, our soldiers, our diplomats, are above corruption. But in the case of Kiki Camarena, justice wasn't just denied. It was delayed. Destroyed. And disfigured. And what did we get instead? Press conferences. Symbolic arrests. And a silence that stretched for decades. But the story didn't end there. Because while the cover-up may have worked in 1985, the files didn't stay buried. Not forever. And as the walls began to crumble, one man stood at the center of it all. Not a drug lord. Not a president. But Kiki's own brother. He spent 30 years chasing the truth. Writing letters. Interviewing agents. Demanding answers. And finally, he got access to the sealed files. And what he found was worse than he imagined. The trials. The betrayal. The fallout from secrets too big to contain. Because Kiki's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. A scar carved into the conscience of two nations. A reminder that when governments lie, people die. The truth didn't die with Kiki Camarena. It just went underground. And now, it's finally coming to light. There's a kind of silence that comes after a funeral. It lingers in the walls. It creeps through birthdays. It echoes in the laughter that's just a little too forced. For the Camarena family, that silence has lasted decades. When the body of Enrique Camarena was flown back to California in 1985, it wasn't just a coffin that returned. It was a wound. One stitched in secrets, and left to rot in the open. His wife, Geneva, held the nation's grief on her shoulders. She cried on the steps of the Capitol. She pleaded before committees. But justice, real justice, never arrived. His children, once told their father was a hero, would grow up asking questions no one wanted to answer. And one of them? Michael Camarena. While the world saw a martyr, Michael saw a ghost. A father who never came home. A memory used by politicians. A man turned into symbol, not truth. He watched the headlines. He listened to the speeches. And he knew something was wrong. Something still didn't add up. The DEA called Kiki a hero. The US government promised revenge. Mexico made arrests. Names were taken. Statements filed. Plaques unveiled. But behind all the ceremonies, not a single true mastermind ever paid. Don Neto was released. Caro Quintero vanished, then reappeared. Gallardo aged into myth. And those who knew the full story, they kept quiet. So Michael Camarena made a decision. He wouldn't just be the son of a martyr. He would become the voice his father was denied. He became a lawyer. Not to avenge the death, but to uncover the truth. Over the years, he would push for investigations. He would appear on talk shows, interviews, press panels. Not for fame. Not for money. But for accountability. His crusade was never about closure. It was about answers. But what he found instead was obstruction. Denials. Bureaucracy wrapped in grief. The story the public knew. That Kiki was abducted by rogue cartel members. That he was tortured for 30 hours. That justice was served. That story was convenient. It wasn't complete. Years later, documents surfaced. Leaks whispered of something bigger. The CIA. Drug flights. Protected traffickers. Allegations that shook even seasoned agents. Could it be that Kiki wasn't just caught in a cartel's rage? Could it be he knew something he wasn't supposed to know? Michael didn't claim to have proof. But he had questions. So many questions. And no one seemed willing to answer them. The story of Enrique Camarena had become too big to control. A name etched into DEA walls. A martyr invoked at ceremonies. A face shown at academy graduations. But the truth? The truth remained in the shadows. Decades later, Michael would still get calls. From retired agents. From journalists. From men who said, "I can't speak on record, but here's what I know." Every story different. Every lead fractured. Every path, a dead end. And yet, he never stopped looking. What makes a legacy? Is it the medals? The tributes? The documentaries? Or is it the questions left unanswered? Kiki Camarena was a husband, a father, a man who loved his job and believed in justice. But when you ask his family what he truly wanted, they'll tell you it wasn't revenge. It wasn't martyrdom. It was simply the truth. The right to do his job. The right to come home. And for his killers, not just the ones with guns, but the ones in suits who let it happen. To face justice. That part of the story? Still unwritten. The real culprits? Still walking free. And Kiki's ghost? Still knocking. Michael Camarena still fights. Not for closure. Not for headlines. But so that no other child has to grow up wondering why the truth was too dangerous to tell. Because in the end, a cover-up doesn't bury the past. It buries the future. And while Kiki's story may seem over, in the shadows of both nations, it still haunts the halls of power. Because a ghost with a badge doesn't forget. So ask yourself, was it just a cartel hit? Or was it a message? And if it was a message, who was it really meant for? They tortured a U.S. federal agent for over 30 hours. Burned his skull. Smashed his ribs. Crushed his soul. And somehow, they walked away. For years, the U.S. claimed that the Guadalajara Cartel was shattered. That justice had prevailed. That those responsible for Enrique Kiki Camarena's murder had been caught. But here's what they didn't say. Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, El Padrino, was finally arrested in 1989. Not for murder, but for drug trafficking. They got him on the paperwork, not the pain. He was sentenced to 37 years. But served most of it in relative comfort. Private cell. Personal chefs. Special visits. He held cartel meetings from prison. Even behind bars. Gallardo never really fell. Decades later, his body failing, sight fading, he was transferred to house arrest. The godfather of Mexican narcos. Died not in a cell, but in comfort. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto, was arrested with him. He served some time. But in 2017, after just a fraction of his sentence, he too was released. On humanitarian grounds. He's still alive. Reportedly living peacefully in Mexico. In a luxurious home. Gardens. Security. Family visits. Then there's Rafael Caro Quintero. The man who ordered Kiki's abduction. The man who oversaw the torture. He was captured in 1985, just months after Kiki's death. Sentenced to 40 years. But in 2013, he was suddenly released. A paperwork technicality, they said. The court claimed he had been tried improperly. He disappeared the same day. For nearly a decade, he became a ghost. The DEA placed him on its top 10 most wanted list. A $20 million bounty. More than for any terrorist. But Caro wasn't hiding in caves. He was operating again. Running a new cartel faction. Laundering money. And, according to U.S. intelligence, targeting agents. He was finally recaptured in 2022, deep in the Sinaloan mountains. In a dramatic military raid. But even that arrest came too late. The damage was done. The message was clear. Murder a DEA agent? You might still live long enough to die in a king-sized bed. Kiki Camarena's family wasn't awarded luxury. His widow, Mika, raised their children without him. She fought for justice that often whispered, but rarely spoke. In interviews, she recalled watching those men walk free. How she cried when she learned of Don Nito's release. How she screamed when she saw Caro giving interviews from hiding. How the U.S. government offered words, but not answers. The killers lived better than the family of the man they killed. That wasn't just injustice. That was a wound that never closed. Years passed. The DEA reorganized. America invaded Panama. The cartels split. reformed, multiplied. But for the agents who knew Kiki, there was no closure. Only betrayal. And it wasn't just the cartel who got away. There were judges, lawyers, politicians, police commanders, all who played a role. None of them served time. Some still hold office. Some built careers off their anti-cartel stances, while hiding the blood on their hands. What happened to Kiki Camarena wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. One made by a system so broken that the only man who paid the ultimate price was the one trying to stop it. Some agents still say Kiki's case was a wake-up call, that it forced reforms. Others? They say the real message was, don't dig too deep. Don't get too close. Don't be like Kiki. As the cartel evolved, splintering into Sinaloa, Juarez, and Tijuana factions, the ghost of Guadalajara never really died. It just changed names. And changed hands. To this day, thousands of kilos cross the border every week. The violence has spread beyond Mexico, into Chicago, LA, Toronto, Africa. And yet, the original architects, the men who got away, laid the blueprint. If justice is a scale, then Kiki's murder tipped it. And it never came back. His killers were supposed to rot in cells. Instead, they wrote their own history. Even in prison, Gallardo gave interviews. He blamed the DEA. Said Kiki wasn't even a target. That everything was a misunderstanding. Caro? He claimed innocence. Even after his arrest in 2022, he smiled during extradition hearings. Fonseca? He vanished from the press altogether. But somewhere, behind iron gates and silence, the man lives. Still free. Still untouched. So was justice ever truly served? Or was Kiki Camarena just a name carved in marble, while his killers carved out their legacies? But there's one more thing the public never saw. Something the government still won't talk about. A name buried in files. A case buried in shame. Because what if Kiki wasn't just a casualty of cartel power, but of something deeper? 3 men were arrested. Don Neto, Caro Quintero, Felix Gallardo. But none of them really paid. Caro? He vanished into legend for decades, protected, it's believed, by high-ranking Mexican military officers. Don Neto? Sentenced, but released early on medical grounds. And Gallardo? He sat in a Mexican prison cell for decades, denied involvement in Kiki Camarena's murder, even as the evidence circled him like wolves. But in the eyes of Kiki's colleagues, this wasn't justice. This was a carefully orchestrated retreat. A performance. An illusion of consequences. After Kiki's mutilated body was discovered in a shallow ditch near La Angostura, the DEA launched its most aggressive internal manhunt ever. Operation Leyenda. Hundreds of agents. Thousands of interviews. Millions of dollars spent. But despite the firepower, the funding, the fury, Leyenda hit a wall. A wall with government seals and black ink. Reports went missing. Evidence couldn't be located. Witnesses disappeared. Leads were quietly abandoned. And for some strange reason, certain names kept getting erased. Inside the DEA, morale collapsed. Agents began whispering about the real reasons Kiki had been targeted. Not just because he found the Rancho Buffalo Grow operation. Not just because he embarrassed the cartel. But because he was asking the wrong questions. Kiki wasn't just looking at drugs. He was looking at money laundering. At banking trails that led to legitimate U.S. institutions. And worse, he was beginning to ask about the CIA. You see, at the time, the CIA was deeply involved in Central America. Funneling weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. Propping up anti-communist regimes. fighting its own secret war under Reagan's doctrine. And to fund it, they needed money. Some say they turned a blind eye to the drug flow. Others say they helped it. And when Kiki started peeling back that curtain, some believe he sealed his fate. We may never know the full truth, because the documents are still sealed. For national security. That's what the official stamp says. But national security for who? For the United States? Or for the men who ran drugs and war side by side? Operation Leyenda began to implode. Agents who pushed too far. Reassigned. Demoted. Some even died mysteriously. One senior agent, Phil Jordan, later claimed, "We were told to stop asking questions. To let it go." And just like that, America moved on. The public was given closure. A few arrests. A few headlines. A name to curse, Caro Quintero. But beneath it all, the real players were untouched. The banks. The brokers. The intelligence assets. Untouchable. And what about the man they were supposed to honor? Enrique Kiki Camarena. A husband. A father. A patriot. He wasn't a spy. He wasn't a politician. He was a man who believed in the law. And in the end, the law abandoned him. In 1990, Time magazine published an article titled, "The Betrayal of Agent Camarena." And even then, they only scratched the surface. In the decades since, more has leaked. Whistleblowers. Confidential memos. Buried surveillance tapes. Each one raising the same question. Did the U.S. government cover up the truth about Kiki Camarena's murder? Was it revenge? Or was it a warning to every agent who thought they could chase the truth too far? Because if Kiki Camarena could be silenced, tortured, murdered, forgotten, then who was safe? Today, Caro Quintero is once again behind bars. Gallardo is aging in a prison cell. Don Neto is gone. But the system that protected them? It still exists. And the cover-up? It didn't end with Operation Leyenda. Because when secrets are sealed for national security, they're never meant to be unsealed. So, who really killed Kiki Camarena? Was it the cartel? Was it the Mexican state? Was it something deeper, more dangerous? We may never know. Because justice wasn't just delayed. It was buried. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it screaming from the dirt. But there's one final chapter. The aftermath. The damage. The question Kiki never got to answer. What was it all for? In our final moments, we ask the question that has haunted his family, his brothers in the DEA, and a generation of truth seekers. If justice can be bought, then what's the price of a man's life? Enrique Kiki Camarena never lived to see the impact he had on the world. But his death sparked a wildfire. It launched investigations, brought traffickers to justice, and changed how America fought drugs forever. But it also revealed something darker. That in the shadow wars between cartels, politics, and profit, truth is the first casualty. He was a father, a husband, a patriot, and somewhere between the borders and the bureaucracy, he was betrayed. By enemies in the field, and allies in suits. So now, we ask you, was Kiki betrayed by his own government? Or is betrayal just the price of survival in the cartel world? If this story moved you, drop a comment below. Tell us what you believe really happened. Let's give Kiki the voice he was denied. Backhand index pointing down, was he betrayed? Or silenced? Tell us below. Backhand index pointing down. And if you want more uncensored stories from inside the drug war, stories they tried to bury, subscribe to True Crime Cartel. We're just getting started. This was the DEA agent who was tortured to death, and the cover-up that followed. Headphone, a true crime cartel original.